Okay. So the effects of the post-colonial mission in Navajoland has been an issue with a lot of our residents and the people here. And I'm going to take you through a journey that looks at some of the key history points in the United States development of what they call progress in America. And these key points in history affect the spirituality, the language, the identity, everything that we have as a culture, a unit, as a tribe has been affected by these acts. And so one of the first acts that's obvious and apparent was the doctrine of discovery. Doctrine of discovery was, and this is a depiction of what they call the progress, American progress, where you have Lady Liberty there with the explorers pushing into the darkness and the light and the dark and the hope of America. And the Doctrine of Discovery was a paper bull that was a couple of them, and the one that took place that affects us was from Pope Alexander VI. It was issued called the Inter Criteria in 1493. It justifies Christian European explorers claiming on lands and waterways they allegedly discovered, and promotes Christian denominations and security, and has applied in Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and in America. The Doctrine of Discovery was the inspiration for the 1800s for the Monroe documents, which declare U.S. Over the Western Hemisphere, and the Manifest Destiny, which justified American expansion westward. And it was projected that it believed that the U.S. was sustained its control over all lands and the Atlantic from the Pacific and beyond. So in these documents, they are still legally bounded by cases, by court cases, and can still be used and have been justified with Supreme Courts today. The first court case that was established was in 1823, Johnson versus the Matonax tribe, in the Doctrine of Discovery became part of the U.S. federal law and was used to dispose Native Americans in the lands and to allow that land to be taken over. And so these were kind of what documents were taken, removing from the east, and explorers were heading to the west. So with the Doctrine of Discovery, it was a premise to justify focus on colonialism, including the enslavement of Africans, Americans, and Asians and peoples, and well, oppression and genocide of indigenous people. The doctrine will remain embedded in the legal policies of the U.S. and colonialized nations throughout the world policies, and maintain a theological, political, and legal justification for containing non-colonialism, including the season of land, genocide, oppression, and racism. Through General Convention, since I've been there, my 3 years training that I've been there, I've seen several efforts to resolution to try and bring out the Doctrine of Discovery so that it would be embedded into the Episcopal denomination. And the wonderful thing is that the Episcopal Church has renounced the Doctrine of Discovery, urging dioceses, reflection actions, coming to learn how allies can be deconstructed in the efforts of the doctrine or as a social force in the church and the nations in the world. Then we are the only denomination that has renounced, repudiated where we would like to be here in the later time, so that it's all the actions that have been given from the doctrine that we would like to reconcile back. One of the other major events in our society is with the long walk. And the Long Walk was another genocidal campaign with the government, so that a lot of it was a controlling system mechanism, so that the tribes of Navajoland could be removed, of course, from the land again, and that could be that people could have access more to boundaries in this area. Of course, it was like the Wild West, And this one was particularly referred to as the Death March. And the Death March refers to the 1864 deportation and attempts ethnic cleansing of the Navajo people in the United States and from the federal government. Navajos were forced to walk from the land that what is now Arizona to eastern New Mexico. Some 43 different focus marches occurred between August of 1864 and the end of 66. Some anthropologists claim that the collective traumas of the Long Walk is crucial to the competency of Navajos sensing the identity of what is now the people. It's pretty funny because you notice on this presentation it says led by Colonial Kit Carson. And I serve at the Good Shepherd Mission there in Fort Defiance, Arizona. And Window Rock was one of the main points, which is right near Fort Defiance in the Good Shepherd Mission Church, Episcopal Church. That's where one of the first places that a lot of Navajos were gathered. And our street that our church sits on one Kit Carson Drive. Isn't that the ironic piece? The history reminds us that it's still there, it's still part of who we are. And so when a lot of these efforts were brought in so that they could remove the people and try to control them a little more, it was all still part of us today. And it's a reminder. So the Long Walk started in the beginning in 1864. Bands of Navajos led by the Army were relocated from the traditional lands in eastern Arizona Territory and western New Mexico Territory to Fort Sumner, which is called the Bosque Redonde. But for us Navajos, we call that Huelte. At least 200 died during the 18-day, 300-mile trek between 8,000 to 9,000 people were settled in the area, about 40 square miles, with the peak population of 9,022 by the spring of 1865. And this was a problem for the Army. They could not man, they couldn't feed, they couldn't maintain, they couldn't take care of a body that big. So a lot of people started to die. And as I start to be more involved with our indigenous missioners and the ministry here, our missioner Brad Hoff, part of the Episcopal Church under the presiding bishop, we start to have more conversations about the reactions of the Long Walk and the trauma, and they're horrific stories. A lot of newborns that could not be taken care of at the time were killed so the progress can continue. A lot of elders that could not stay behind end up venturing off to the side and died on their own. A lot of women would bathe themselves in feces just so that the cavalry, the army, would not rape them repeatedly, so they would not be sought out. So these kind of tactics were really horrific in the actions of the Long Walk and what had happened. So on June 18th in 1868, the one scattered band of the people who were called the Dene set off together to return journey from the Long Walk back home. This is one of the few times that the U.S. government permitted a tribe to return to their traditional boundaries. The Navajos were granted 3.5 million acres of the land instead, inside the Four Sacred Mountains. The Navajos also became more cohesive tribe after the Long Walk and were able to successfully increase the size of the reservation Since then, it's 16 million acres. So when we were attending the last General Convention in Austin, Texas, we had a group of deputies, which were all 4 Navajos and 4 Lady, which is the first time we've ever had a full roster of Navajos for General Convention. We traveled from Fort Defiance into Texas, and then so we passed through the Bosque Redondo, the Huelte Center, and we sat there and we had to offer our corn pollen for the many lives that were lost. And so it was a pretty emotional time for us to be there. We did not say anything to each other. We all had our individual prayers, and we offered our blessings for the healing. And after we came back, we learned a lot about what we did. A lot of the elders were disapprove of our visit there, because they said once we had left that place that we promised that we would never return, and so we would never go back to that place to endure that. And there was quite a bit of movements and teachings around this within the oral culture of our society. And one of the biggest teachings that we learned, that I remember learning about, was a song in high school or elementary school. And I thought it was just a really good song to sing, and come to find out it was the commitment to not returning to the long walk site. And it goes like this: She na sha, she na sha, she na sha, ujon bekeho jon na sha. And that means, in beauty I will walk, beauty before me I will return, beauty before me I will return. And when the walk back to the lands was made, a lot of the elders were singing this in joy and returning to committing to live in a better way of life. And that's where the commitment of the they call it the beauty way of life, which is a commitment that's also called the beauty pathway, the pollen pathway. And it looks very much like the presiding bishop's concept of the Jesus movement, living in beauty with the clanship system and all this that was set up. So there are a lot of historical trauma that's brought from a lot of these movements from the government. But we start to move into ecumenically what type of influence would our church have on these types of movements. One of the first assimilation programs that was in the treaty when the Navajos and a lot of natives were allowed back on their land was they would be assimilated into a boarding school program. And one of the first programs that was set was from General Harold Pratt. And Harold Pratt was an army sergeant, and he had some slaves, some Native American slaves that were on campus. And he started to teach them different ways of life. And so they became the pilot program for what he was about to introduce to the government. And this reformatory program became the boarding school relocation program. So with the boarding schools, the truth about the United States boarding schools policy was largely written in the history books, but more than 350 government funds and often churches ran Indian boarding schools across the U.S. in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by the government agents, sent to the schools and hundreds of miles away, and beaten, starved, and otherwise abused. Even then, they speak for them to keep them from speaking their language. Beginning with the Boarding School Civilization Act Fund in March 3rd of 1819, the peace policy of 1869 the United States, the concept with and the urging of several denominations of the Christian church adopted the Indian boarding school policy, expressly intent to implement cultural genocide, though the removal of the programming of American Indians and Alaskan Natives children to accomplish the systematic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The states proposed this policy, and these policies were brought on by General Pratt's concept of kill the man, kill the Indian, save the man. So if they could forcibly remove the Native culture, the Indian inside the person, there's still a man that's savable and trainable. And so this became a policy of the U.S. government. Between 1869 and 1890s, it was likely that hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in boarding school operated by the federal government and the churches. Though we didn't know how many of the children were taken in total, by the 1800s there was about 20,000 children in boarding schools, and by 1925 the numbers had tripled. The U.S. Native children that were violently removed from their homes, families, and communities during this time were taken to school far away, where they were punished to speak their language, banned from acting in any way that might be seen as recent traditional cultural practices, stripping their traditional clothing, their hair was cut, personal belongings, behavior reflected of the Native cultures. They suffered psychological, physical, sexual, cultural, and spiritual abuse and neglect, and experienced treatment that was in many cases constricted, torment for speaking and their native language. Many children never return home to their fates, have yet to have accountability by the U.S. government. So the United States still has not released any documents about what has happened within these boarding school walls. Canada has released their documents. And so when Canada had released their documents about what was happening inside the walls, the U.S. government realized that from Canada's experience, that this might be happening inside the U.S. And so they changed the reformatory of the boarding school from the military style to local churches. And that's where our churches in Navajoland, when a lot of churches were flocking to the Native communities, when they were becoming agencies for the U.S. government, were filtering these children out to these boarding schools. Here in Arizona, there's a site there in the middle of Phoenix called the Indian Boarding School, and that's where a lot of kids were brought from the reservation, put on the train, and shipped out to Oklahoma, to areas far away, so that they would be away from their families. So a lot of the genocidal impacts that happen with the historical trauma from boarding schools, for an individual, you have a loss of identity, you have low self-esteem, no sense of safety, and they're feeling more institutionalized, difficulty forming healthy relationships within the family structure. Some families lost their parental power, near destruction and extended family systems. I had one father that couldn't understand why his way of discipline was too harsh. He couldn't figure out why was he not allowed to do what he was doing. He said, well, I learned this from the way I was treated, so generationally I started passing that down. And so those are kind of the examples. For tribes, a lot of the sense of loss of community, of course, the language is being lost. The assimilation practice is still being done today inadvertently. The loss of tribal traditional ceremonies because of the persecution from a lot of the churches. And even still today, as I move to this new church area, I attend a church of a local denomination, and I had my jewelry and my turquoise on, and they told me, whoa, 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 you got to leave that at the door. You can't come in with that. You've got to leave that traditional cultural stuff outside before you can come into the church. And so that's still being practiced today individually with a lot of denominations across the Navajo Nation. So as a tribe, we're weakening by the structure, and there's just, I call that the ripple effect. And if you look at today's generation, you had this huge trauma dropped in the middle of the home lake, and then you start to see that this ripple effect is deep and wide, and it's heavy. And as it starts to get to the outsides of that lake where we're at, we don't know what's wrong with us. We can't figure out why we're so angry, so why we're a certain way. Well, it's that ripple effect that's still affecting our children, affecting the people today, and we just don't know it yet. Of course, one of the things that churches picked up during this time was part of the language when the explorers came out to move west from the eastern coast was the idea of native culture being paganistic, being a pagan ritual that a lot of people can't understand and really have a hard time justifying as God as part of that. So when I was in VTS, Virginia Theological Seminary, I did a paper, exegesis paper on Genesis 11, 1 through 9. And this really brought me to think about this particular bridge of Navajo spirituality and the culture that was sitting there. And the passage is about the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is where a lot of the people that were coming together to build this tower, and they all had the common language and the common knowledge of a community. And God did not want them to build this tower up, so he dispersed the language. And by dispersing the language, they could not communicate with each other. And so all these tribes started to migrate out around the world. And my argument was, what if we were one of those tribes? What if the Navajo, Dene people, the Athabascan people were part of that tribe with our own unique particular language? We don't dismiss the idea of a higher being. We still seek the Creator. We still seek the idea of being in wholeness, but we interpret that in our own direction. Our culture is derived around what we call the immersion story. And if you look at the picture on the left, there are many layers starting on the bottom, the dark piece of that, which depicts very similar to the Genesis story. And in the Genesis story, there was darkness. There was nothing. And then there was the deities, the gods that created men and women from matter. That is the same story that is part of our emergent story. The Deians, the Creator, created men and women. And then they emerge out of this world into the next world with all these teachings and blessings of the creation of their own identity through where they're from. And if you remember, I told you about the return to the lands within the four sacred mountains. You look on that platform right there, you can see four mountain structures on all four different corners. And within that is the Netka, the Navajo Nation structure. And so that's where our people feel like that's the reason why we are stewards of this land. That's why we feel like we were so connected to this land. It was because of the emergence story and all that's happening. So on the right, you see the medicine chanters, call them the medicine men, Hakathi. They're making these sand paintings. These are all just powdered sand that's being painted in a traditional ceremony And all that is the same depictions of all this deities that's there. And so we see a lot of misunderstanding with the culture and tradition. I want to tell you a little story about one of my, from St. Christopher's, Harold Baxter Liebler was his name. He was a priest out of the diocese in Connecticut. And he came to Navajoland to do mission work, and he wanted to evangelize and teach the Navajos about culture and tradition and those kind of things. And he ended up learning more than he expected. So one example was infusing culture and using tradition with the Christianity. It was right near Easter, and he wanted to bring more people into the church. And he said, "What do I do?" So he said, "Well, I'll depict the resurrected Jesus in sand painting." So he went and got a bunch of sand, and right in the middle of the church, he put this sand painting that you see right there, the example. He started doing a sand painting of Jesus, and right behind Jesus, the halo was dark, depicting the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so the word got around the reservation. Oh, this guy, he's practicing medicine. He's practicing the sand painting. And so the very next week, we started getting rain. After a 17-year drought, there was rain coming all over, and people said, "Wow, Mr. Liebler, Baxter Liebler, your medicine is strong," they told him. So with that, a lot of people started coming to church. The medicine men were asking questions. They were wanting to know more about this God that welcomes him in. So here's Harold Baxter Liebler's autobiography about Boy My Heart for Me, which he learned a lot about the culture. He learned of the language. He learned how to be in community, allowed the Holy Spirit to guide. Another infusion, this is the church, the picture of our church, the Good Shepherd Mission, and this mission church has a lot of woven rugs, has a lot of imagery of Navajo spirituality that's part of the service. Even the language and the prayers are in Navajo, the gospel's read in Navajo. So people see this as an inclusion where they want to be. It not only allows us to be who we are, but it allows a community to be part of a healing process. Turning back a little bit at a time, what might we do with this church that would welcome us back into being who we really are? Of course, this was not a vision that was recent. This was a vision of our first Navajo bishop. Bishop Stephen Plummer was a big influence on a program that he was trying to initiate called the Hogan Learning Circle. And a Hogan is a house structure made of earth, and you'll see one in this video here pretty soon. And it's made of earth, which connects to Mother Earth. And so it's depicted as the central place where we were born, and we can return in safety into this house. And it's usually made out of wood and then covered in the sand. So the Hogan Learning Circle was designed to raise local leaders, Navajo leadership, laity leadership in the church. It was also designed to empower youth education. And in some instances, we had an educator out of one of our parishioners, a lay leader, who developed a 3-year lectionary for Bible study. But it had the influence of the Navajo tradition and culture, so that the imagery that the kids see during the lectionary series were things that they could relate to. And so they had more conversations. They were more open to be part of that. And so that was a fun piece in what we were doing. Of course, there was self-sustainability financially and Navajo staff, and having the ability to have a staff to do pastoral ministry within the community. And really, this is not just something that we did on our own, but this is something that we could be participants of the life of the church. And this is that very moment now that we're expressing this to show what we have for the life of the church. So I was thinking about a lot of these, and a lot of the 5 marks of mission is what we look at when we do our visioning, our mission statements of what we're going to do. And so, of course, proclaiming the good news. You know, it's a big thing for us when we hear the gospel in Navajo. We can have conversations about it. You know, we had a Bible study with our elders, and we had translated the gospel in Navajo. And it was the parable of St. John the Baptizer eating locusts and honey and shouting in the wilderness. And the elder said, Hashul, yeah, the locusts, which means, what does that mean, locusts, in here in the text? So we showed him in the Navajo translation that it's Winneschidi. Locusts in Navajo means Winneschidi. And they say, wow, that's in the Bible? They said, well, we used to, when we were kids, we used to eat these locusts. When we herd sheep, we go out for long distance and herding sheep. And we couldn't pack sandwiches or things, so we would take rhubarb and put them on a fire and locusts and roast it, and then we would eat that for necessities for the trip back. And then they said, well, what if Jesus taught our great-great-great-grandparents about these ways of life in traditional cultures, and we're now still expressing that. And so that made my heart feel good about their inclusion in the gospel. And of course, you know, the teaching to baptize and nurture new believers. This is actually a picture of the Reverend Catalina and I during our diaconate. And this is a medicine man who is in the ordination process. Most would menstruate and get down, but we sat and we allowed this medicine man to come and bless us with corn pollen in the beauty way ceremony. So that was the participation view in front of the congregation to see the inclusion of service was still the same emphasis of the Christian movement. And then a lot of our churches currently are responding to the human needs of the community, offering food, offering basic living supplies, water, things of that sort. And of course, we have a young, vibrant group here, the Reverend Michael Sales. We have lay leader and our Chase Deb Shop, GJ Gordy, who is a part of our ministry as well, doing some justice work for the community. And this is my favorite, safeguarding the safety of our creation and sustaining renewable. You know, we do that with community farms. We're committed to the Good News Garden here in Navajoland by promoting community farms, by promoting sustainable foods, food education, desert foods. And this picture on the right is the group of kids that were part of the Back to the Kitchen Table movement culinary program. And this is where we start to teach and nurture our young kids about how to become sustainable, how to garden, how to forage, how to make traditional ingredients into modern dishes. And it was really a program that inspired me to continue moving forward in the ministry. And so they're proud of who they are in their chef jackets. So if I can, I want to play a little video. Let's see if I can find it. The video is kind of a film of our food program, the Good Shepherd Mission. Kind of gives you a feel for the land itself. This is our campus on the Good Shepherd Mission during the food program. We have people lined up to receive food. Those are all the buildings that were used for boarding school responding. So this is our food program that was established. We had 5 different churches. We provide food for 4 other chapter houses. We try to put pantry items, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. This center here is deemed the Hojo Center. And this is our receiving area for my church at the Good Shepherd. So it's quite a task feeding 2,000 people a month. In these food boxes, not only food, feminine hygiene, cleaning supplies. We also put 1 month's worth of lectionary readings. We put hand washing prayers inside the boxes as well. We offer meditation coloring material for the kids, because a lot of what was happening was that these kids were isolated at home. So a lot of people could not get out. A lot of people could not be part of couldn't be part of it because of the COVID. So a lot of people that were isolated, some people could come out and get their food boxes, but for probably half of the time, we would deliver about, enough food for about 500 to 800 people in the family. So these are people that could not drive to the local pickup spots to get their food. They had to utilize other means of transportation. So we would take these out to them. We would also provide water, because the lack of infrastructure for these communities is there. Some people use cardboard boxes for insulation for their walls. So there's a lot of need for the infrastructure of families, and so we try to provide these kind of services for people out there. The wonderful thing for us at doing this kind of ministry is it's the very thing that Michael Curry has asked us to do, to get outside the church, to get out and get outside and be the church in the community. And so doing this and experiencing this has really brought the relationship back into community. They see us coming back the 9th and 10th time and go, wow, what are you doing? Why do you do this? Why do you come out here to feed us like this? And say, well, do you need a food? Yeah, well, we'll see you next month. And they're really appreciative of that, And so it really says something about the old word of evangelism, the old dirty word of evangelism, and that whole missionality of expecting something for the church if we do something for you. So people are very surprised that we're being able to get out there and be with people in a way that just allows them to be who they are, and we're not expecting anything else except being with them. So I'll send this presentation to Molly, and so that way, if any of you want the resources that I have here listed, these are the literature that I used for this presentation, and where we move forward with that. Also, there will be some online resources so that you might be able to look at some of these, like the Doctrine and Discovery, the boarding school, even our own Navajoland Area Mission.org website, so you can get some of those information. To close this up, I'd like to read one of our commissioning prayers in Navajo and also in English translation, because this was one of the prayers that my great-grandfather put together with our priest at the time. And so they both worked on this prayer to commission our parishioners after every service to go out and become disciples. And it talks about the relationship between God, us, and creation. It brings all three elements into a prayer so that when they go out, they can keep those three in mind. So this is called the Blessing Way Prayer. Jesus Christ, Sekhnat Ani, Yenayote Biyatinlini, Kadni Lishla, Di Janiyasani, Di Janin Suisani, Anjtinigi, Anjtedo. Nabahaz Ani Bik Echo Nashado. Anjali Antero, Shigedin Ito, Shicha Sinzin, Shicha Tatilnito, Shicha Hanzito, Zeniade Shicha Hojondo, Chiliade Shicha Hojondo, Indachi de Shicha Hojondo, Da Wilti de Shicha Hojondo, Da Deni de Shicha Hojondo, Ashe Natona Hotleto, Ashe Tradadina Hotleto, Shikajet Hojondo. Shekede Hojondo, Sahat Narain Shlido, Bik Hojon Shlido, Hojana Hasli, Hojana Hasli, Hojana Hasli, Hojana Hasli. This is the English translation. Jesus Christ, young man chief, God's almighty son, now I've made your offering, your smoke I have made. Today your child I become. Today your grandchild I became. As you say to me, will I do your commandments, I will follow. Just as I pray to you, you will do it. Watch over me. You stand as my defense. In my defense, stretch out your hands. Lead in my defense. From the wood streams to me be peace. From all growing things to me be peace. From breeze courses to me be peace. From passing rains to me be peace. From passing thunders to me be peace. Just by me let dew fall. Just by me let corn fall in form. Before me peace. Behind me peace. Walk a long life may I be. Always in peace I be. Peace has returned. Peace has returned. But that is a conclusion of my presentation about the effects and the healing in Navajoland. And in the words that you see on your screen, I say, Aheha. Thank you.